Sean is the co-founder and CTO of Chartboost. We're the largest cross-promotion platform for mobile games. Before being at Chartboost, Sean was back-end engineer at Tapulous, the company behind Tap Tap Revenge that was acquired by Disney. And actually, since we submitted the talk, we've grown that much. So today, he's going to talk about what have been the main learnings and challenges of scaling a platform that today works with 60,000 mobile games. So please help me welcome Sean FANNAN.
Cool. Thanks, Pepe. Okay, cool. Thanks, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Super happy that I could make the trip out from San Francisco. Like Pepe was mentioning, my talk is about looking back in the last 3 years and trying to pinpoint some major learnings that I have and communicate those learnings to you guys as you guys venture onto a similar journey. So let me start out by giving you some background about myself that Pepe didn't mention. I'm from California. I'm from a place called Lake Tahoe. I went to college in Santa Barbara. I lived in China for 4 years, worked at a bunch of companies. I was the first engineer at Tapulous, and that led to starting Chartboost. So we've been around for about 3 years now, and actually tomorrow is our big three-year birthday. So it's pretty cool. We started the company on Valentine's Day, so my wife always says it's the worst day ever to start a company. Cool, so I'm going to jump right into it. I don't have a lot of time. So I have 3 main learnings that I want to talk about. So the first one is don't get attached. So I'm going to talk about how I threw out all the code on day 21 of starting the company. So what do I mean by don't get attached? So attachment is like this thing that's common in human beings. Like everyone gets attached to things that you work on. If you're a creator or you're an idea person, you get attached to things. And attachment for startups and gaming companies comes in all shapes and sizes. So for us, you can get attached to like big visionary ideas. You can get attached to small, detailed, like what is the type of some specific database field or whatever. And my thing is don't get attached to anything, especially at the very beginning when the company's starting, because every decision you make has huge implications on what happens in the future. So I'll give you guys a little anecdote. So when 3 years ago, Maria and I, my co-founder, were starting this company, we had just left Tapulous. We were up-and-coming entrepreneurs, so we were figuring out like the logistics of starting a company and so forth. And we brainstormed a bit, and then we had a pretty good idea. So we were literally sitting in a coffee shop. We didn't have an office. We had an idea, so I just went to town and started coding. So I spent 3 weeks coding what was to be the prototype for Chartboost. So fast forward 3 weeks later, and I had a pretty functional prototype. I had an ad server, a dashboard, like a lot of the same things that people are familiar with Chartboost. We had that after 3 weeks. I hired my first engineer, and it was the first time for me to bounce ideas back and forth. And as we started to look into what we had built and what were the next steps to take, I realized we had made a few decisions that didn't make any sense. We used a database. We used Amazon SimpleDB for a database, and we looked into it more and realized it didn't necessarily scale. The latencies were pretty high. It didn't work well with PHP. Amazon didn't seem to support it. The traction wasn't as good. We saw Mongo as an alternative to that, and it kind of solved a lot of our problems. I had used a framework called CodeIgniter, which was pretty bulky, and it wasn't a pleasure to use. We looked at alternative frameworks and realized that they were a lot more lightweight, they were more of a pleasure to use, it was easier to develop on. So in the end, I decided we needed to scrap the whole thing, start over again, and do things the right way. So looking back on that decision, this was 3 weeks into the company. You're starting a company, the worst thing you can do is waste 3 weeks, especially at that stage of a company. And I could have easily had this, of course I wanted my own thing. It was my baby at the time to continue on that path and build on top of it. But I was able to separate what I did personally with what we wanted to achieve as a company and building the right kind of product, separate those two and think about it and do the right thing. And I think overall, in any situation, if you can disassociate yourself from being personally attached, you're going to end up building the right product. So the moral is, don't let personal judgment or personal attachment cloud your judgment. The second lesson I have is be thoughtful. So as we sort of transitioned to a bigger company, we had, in the early days, we had like 1 or 2 people, and we started to get bigger, and we suddenly had, 5, 10 people. We started to experience, we were building a lot more features and a lot more products, and what I'm going to talk about is how we re-architected our entire database to last for the future. So when you're starting out, you're in this get shit done mode. You want to go as fast as possible. So for Chartboost, get shit done means speed, productivity, features. We're all about the developers, so we're constantly through the last 3 years, we've been adding features and features and features, and we're at the very beginning, especially, we're just listening to developers. Everything we built, everything we heard, we would just build it. We were very iterative, and we were in this get shit done mode. And the biggest lesson that I found is that a bit of planning can go a long way. So as we grew from 1 or 2 people to 5 people to 10 people, everyone has this stigma about like you go through growing pains, and you go through all these restructural things as a bigger company. And for me, the biggest lesson is actually that's separate. The biggest value that you can add is just a little bit of planning. Just plan things a little bit better. So I'll give you an example for us. We use Mongo everywhere. We have a huge database, powers our whole system. Our whole ad server is built on Mongo. Huge database, huge implications. So in the early days, we, obviously, like we would listen to developers. They'd add more. They'd request things. We'd add them. They'd request more things. We'd add them. iOS would change their UDID system. We'd have to re-architect our database. We were always in that get shit done mentality. And when you have projects that have huge implications, there's better ways to approach the problem that add a lot more value. So in our third pass of this, we took a different approach. We were thoughtful. So what is the Chartboost way of being thoughtful? So it's pretty straightforward, but we literally sat down in a room. We were explicit about like planning the stuff out. So what are we trying to build? What kind of, for this particular case, what kind of latencies do we want to have? How many requests per second do we have now? How big is the database going to be? Like all the database things, all the questions that you want to ask, like be explicit about actually asking those kind of questions. And then we executed on that plan. So fast forward, we're still using that whole system today. We've had a much better, we have a much better system that backs everything up. We plan on using it for the future. And the biggest lesson here is not that it slowed anything down. It literally took 3 days for the whole thing. It wasn't like delayed the whole project, delayed our whole system for months at a time. It was 3 days of work that added this huge amount of value. We're working on it. Our entire benefit from this whole process came from those 3 days of being methodical and thinking about it and knowing what we're building, so that we're a lot more conscious of where we're going in the future. So the moral here is just put a little bit more thought, has a huge value in the long term. Cool, and the last lesson for me is be flexible. So I'm going to talk about how Chartboost has flexibility built into its core. So the first 2 lessons kind of took you through 2 different stages. So one stage is that growth stage where you want to be fast and iterate, and it's all about speed and productivity. And then as you get bigger, you need to be a little bit more thoughtful. Every decision you make has massive implications. For us, we went through a third stage, which is all about just this crazy rocket ship growth. And the question for us was like, how do you sustain that kind of growth? Because we weren't used to that kind of growth. It happens in a very short amount of time. How do you deal with that? And for me, there's kind of like 2 different types of companies that deal with that. The first is the kind of company that builds everything perfectly from day one. I don't know where those companies are, but I think they might exist. And then the second company is the kind of company that's really flexible in its core. We're definitely the second kind of company, so let me give you some examples. So going back to Mongo, I think Mongo is a great solution for us because it allows us to be really flexible in adding new things to our system. So we were never the kind of company that built everything into our system from day one. Anyone that uses Chartboost knows that we have a million different features, and we're always listening to developers and adding new things. And at the core, like the foundation of our system is Mongo, and it allows us to do all these things. It doesn't allow us to think about, oh, well, if we do this thing or this feature, it's going to take a considerable amount of time. We're like one layer above that because we have a good foundation that allows us to be very flexible in what we do. And really, like the reason why we have so many features can really be pinpointed to like this one decision at the very beginning to use Mongo, or something like that that's as flexible as it is. Another example is in our SDK. So we've been really conscious of making our SDK really flexible, both on the developer side and the Chartboost side. So for the developers, we're always really passionate about making the developer have as much flexibility as they can possibly have. So if they want to control what the frame looks like, or what the close button looks like, or even where the close button is positioned, like having as much flexibility in there as possible and letting you control that from the dashboard or from our system on the fly without an SDK update is kind of the ideal situation. So as many flags, as many tweaks, as many knobs as you can have in the SDK without updates. Like our main thing is no SDK updates as much as possible. And then also from the developer's point of view, in terms of like integrating, we really like to give as much control and flexibility for the game developer themselves. So things like having as many delegate methods as you can possibly have, so that you can control like exactly when in the game certain things are happening, or controlling the user experience as much as possible. And finally, from the Chartboost side, we like to control, like I said before, we are adding features all the time. So how do you have an SDK that supports this kind of iterative mentality? Well, we pass through everything. So we try to avoid SDK updates as much as possible, and when we add features, our SDK is built in a dynamic way that allows us to not worry about SDK updates when we add these features. So I'll give you an example. Recently, we just went through a whole creative update where our creative system is completely new. We support all these new Android devices and Retina devices and all these different new devices. And there's a lot more data points that go into tracking all these things. So of course, it's a huge back-end project. It's a huge front-end project. You would think, okay, the SDK obviously is going to have to change as well. Well, it didn't, actually. Our SDK already supported everything that we did. We could draw the new images just the same as we did before. We could track all the new data points the same as we did before. So, and that only could happen if we were conscious of that flexibility when we built the SDK in the first place. And then the last example I have is going back to my old Tapulous days, because I think the first examples kind of give you the sense that maybe, like, of course, you're starting out, you want to be flexible. But that's natural when you're starting out. But when you're more established, maybe it's not as important. And I think flexibility applies to everyone, small and big. So my Tapulous example is, when we were working on Tap Tap Revenge 3, that brand was already pretty well established. We were the biggest app in the App Store. It was a huge brand, and yet when we built it, it was extremely flexible. It was probably the most flexible game I've ever seen. And we built it in a way that had like our entire menu system was completely controlled from the server. We could change the layout of everything, the look and feel of everything. We could A/B test different things. We had a theme engine, so we released songs every week. That only happened because we had this theme engine, so we could go and have a designer design a custom theme for a particular song and not have to worry about the details of okay, we need to add this into the game and submit a new update or anything like that. It was all built into the foundation, and then everyone's sort of working on one level above that. And then finally, it was easy to communicate to users. We all had all these different channels to communicate to users, so it was really flexible. So my best example is we had like a storefront and a news feed and push notifications, all the normal stuff. At one point after the game was launched, we started doing surveys just to get a lot more feedback about what users liked or what songs they liked, stuff like that, and it was a really good way. We didn't even think about surveys when we built the game, but because the game itself was really flexible, we could easily launch that in the future. So it was really valuable, and yet it like sort of facilitated all these features that we didn't even think about when we built the game in the first place. So moral here is just being flexible allows you to go really fast, iterate, evolve. That's the most powerful combination for a gaming company, and especially for games, with submitting apps and that whole approval process, like as being as flexible as possible, is going to apply to any game, small or big. Okay, so in summary, my big 3 lessons: don't get attached, be thoughtful, be flexible. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yep.
How do you deal with the problem when you're starting on a big venture like this, that you have to make your biggest decisions that have the greatest consequences right at the start when you know the least about them? You know, like you started with simple DB and then changing over to mongoDB. How do you deal with that lack of knowledge?
Yeah, I don't know. I think half of it is just good intuition. You know, I think starting out being very iterative goes a long way too, you know, because if you're committed to big things forever, that's not going to work unless you just have good ideas from the very beginning. So, you know, when we first started, especially, we had a lot of, you know, we tried a lot of things, failed really quickly, tried other things, just like kind of stepped in and out, I would say, like got really deep into things, but also stepped outside on a more like global perspective.
Any other questions? I actually have one question from a team perspective, because I think this is also a big scaling challenge. And taking into account that we might have a lot of indie developers in the room, I mean, how do you structure an engineering team? And when do you start being more thoughtful also on the way you hire and you structure the team?
Mm-hmm. I guess for us, you know, it's changed a lot throughout the growth of the company. So obviously the structure of the team when you're 1 or 2 people is very different from 5 or 10 people, and now, you know, 40 or 50 people. Yeah, I think it's just something you got to be conscious about and ask the right questions all the time. Not like you got to confront it and know what you're getting yourself into. So for us, like, we had basically no structure whatsoever until we were like 6 or 7 engineers, and then we started establishing bigger teams and had owners over different parts of our system. Also for us, we had a lot of like products actually got a lot bigger, so we would have, you know, we didn't, like, a good example is analytics. Like, our first version of analytics was my random analytics stuff, and then, you know, as we started to get a bigger team, we had, you know, analytics engineers that just focused on analytics, and, you know, now we have a huge analytics team, and it's a really core part of the business. So having the ability to like ask the right questions and know what is important, what is not, and then structure the team like that.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much, Sean.